You see, as nice as that flint is and that flintlock, it doesn't work in the rain. As we said, it doesn't work in the snow. It doesn't work too well in the wind or a storm. A man named Alexander Forsyth, who was a reverend in Scotland, came up with an idea of a fulminate. And a fulminate is something that you can pound, and he specifically thought about mercury. And he started to experiment with that. Tower of London thought that was a screwy idea, but then thought, well, maybe that will work if it's an explosion. So what was going to happen was, you see there's a small appendage on this rifle. It's called a cone, or a percussion cone, or nipple. There's going to be a cap, a brass or copper cap filled with a little substance called fulminate of mercury that's going to stick on top of this nipple, so that when you pull the trigger, the hammer hits it. And if any of you are drummers, you know what percussion means, to strike or to hit. That distributes an explosion into the interior of the chamber of the barrel. And the nice thing about the percussion system is, for the most part, it's waterproof. Now you can fight a battle in the snow, the rain, the ice, and the cold. You don't have to have the most beautiful day of the year to fight the battle. Well, technology is progressing at Harpers Ferry Armory in Jefferson County and other armories. Part of the function of Harpers Ferry was to make pieces called pattern pieces. And they were specifically making things to go in the National Arsenal for the regular standing army. But they also made pieces that could be sent out to contractors like Robbins and Lawrence, Asa Waters, Whitney, as we mentioned, some other people. And those folks would create from those template pieces other model pieces, and they would stock state arsenals with them. Well, the problem with that system was that sometimes a contractor gets in a hurry, and sometimes to make quota, to get in on budget, you might cut a few corners. I'm not saying they all did that, but I am saying that it certainly did happen at this period. Some people did that. So what you find in a lot of existing arsenals, state arsenals, in places of collection for weapons at that period, at the Civil War, the antebellum period right before the Civil War, are pieces that need some attention and care. And there are pieces that need to be maintained and need to be re-inspected. In the early years of the Civil War, there were many export pieces brought in. Both sides did it. The federal government brought in Enfields from England. They brought in German pieces. They brought in Belgian pieces. The Confederate government did the same through the blockade. They were trying to get as many pieces of muzzleloading equipment in here to fight the war as possible. And what ended up happening, to be kind, is to say that Europe sort of cleaned out all of her arsenals of the leftovers, and we got them. And when we got them, as I say, some of them were in good working order, some of them were excellent pieces, but then there were those that had problems and were defective. A story that I want to relay to you as far as Jefferson County goes is in the Battle of the Cement Mills at Shepherdstown. The 118th Pennsylvania Corn Exchange Regiment, a brand new federal regiment, had been issued Enfield rifled muskets, the Model 53. And when those guys crossed the Potomac River to assault the Confederate flank, actually none of them had ever loaded and fired their guns. They were issued these contractor pieces that had been brought over, and hadn't really been inspected. What happened was that they knew how to drill with the guns, they knew how to move them around their bodies and how to fix bayonets and do all the other parts that were important. But when they went to load and fire them, some of them recorded that the gun would not fire, or that when they pulled the trigger, the hammer, that's this piece, would fall down and crush the cone. Now, what I did not tell you is that I am a professional blacksmith. So if anybody knows metal in this world, it's probably me. And I can tell you that this gun has a piece called a mainspring. The mainspring is the piece that throws the hammer backwards and the one that you cock to get it forward. When making a spring in a forge, first you shape the piece, and then that spring has to have enough hardness so that it will open and close, open and close. Typically you temper a spring, that is you just soften it enough so that when you pull the trigger it does what it needs to do. It advances the hammer, and it either pops the cap or it strikes the flint. If the spring is not tempered and if it is too hard, it will crack. Or worse, if it is overheated, it's too soft or mushy and it won't fire at all. From the accounts of the 118th Pennsylvania in 1862, they talked about how they pulled the triggers and the hammers either would not pull or they crushed the cone. That tells me that the springs were overly hardened and not tempered. And it also tells me that what happened is that some of those springs were broken inside the lock that we discussed earlier. They didn't know that, and because of that they took a high casualty rate. That's just one of the examples I wanted to point out to you about European armaments coming over under contract. But I do want to get back to the story of the armory at Harpers Ferry and its role in the county. In fact, I'm holding a piece that I want to go to. What this is a copy of a model 1816 69 caliber musket. It's the same caliber as the Charleville flintlock musket that I showed you. The difference is that it has been altered. You'll notice that there's a piece of brass. Okay, that's been filled in where the flintlock pan used to be. Screws have been put in and filed off, and now, curiously, there is a nipple on top of the barrel. That's one of the first, what we're going to call conversion systems for muskets. A lot of these will be used in the Civil War early. You would see a lot of them walking around Jefferson County, I'd say, in 1861 and 1862. For the most part, they worked well. There is a problem. I'll discuss that with you. Sometimes, when using the 1816s in particular, I want you to get this and feature it. These barrels are not machine made. I think we've talked about that. These are handmade barrels, and the welding on them is done by hand. There are some weak spots in some of the 1816 barrels. In fact, Harpers Ferry Armory and Springfield Armory had a barrel failure rate somewhere approaching 35 to 40% at times. And that's not to their detriment, that's just owing to the fact that the quality of the iron was not as good as it could have been. And when the blacksmiths and barrel smiths were making the barrels, they were having a hard time closing the seam and welding the tubes. Nonetheless, barrels were proven at Harpers Ferry. They were loaded with triple the amount of powder and sometimes ball, and then ignited, and if they didn't blow up, they passed the test. That doesn't mean that it didn't open up a little crack or a fissure somewhere else, and in time, maybe that would erode with rust or something, and you would have a weak spot in the barrel. There are recorded instances of muskets exploding on the battlefield. This is one of the reasons why. These are handmade barrels. They're not machine-made barrels. The model 1816 is a handmade product. I want you to remember that. And the nipple or the cone put directly in top of this handmade barrel. If you've done it right, you've gone through the threaded piece of the breech. This is the rear section of the barrel. There's a plug here that's threaded, and hopefully you've got the strength of that wall. If not, you've gone through the thin portion of the barrel, and if there's any weakness whatsoever, when you pull the trigger with a large charge and it hits, well, you get the idea. It's going to blow up, and it's going to probably hit you in the face and kill you or injure you or somebody standing beside you. Were there a lot of 1816s altered? There certainly were. There certainly were lots of them issued out to the troops. The conversions changed from directly putting the nipple on top of the barrel to a piece called a bolster, which I'm going to illustrate with you now, which would come with the next series of pieces. Whoops. I'm holding in my hand a United States Model 1841 Harpers Ferry rifle. You see this appendage on the side. It's rounded on the side of the barrel. It holds the nipple. This is called the bolster. It is strengthened, reinforced, and it is also, by the way, built this way to take an extreme pressure from the fire from the percussion cap and any powder that's in the rear of the piece. It is also designed so that it screws directly into the barrel, and any problems that we would have had with a converted 1816 are avoided. This system was also used when the armory took the 69 caliber weapons and thought about rifling them. We'll get into that in a minute. But what I want to do is just go through the 41 with you, talk about the changes, talk about how it's a revolutionary piece. You see, John Hall left Harper's Ferry in the 1840s, but his machines did not. The mechanization advanced, and the Ordnance Department said, we like the idea. We like the idea of less labor, more machine-made product. We like the idea of a completely machine-made piece. I'm holding it in my hands. The model, the U.S. model 1841, is completely machine-made. I called it a rifle. As we talked about before, it does have lands and grooves on the interior that make the ball spin. This particular rifle was made famous by an individual you would later know as the President of the Confederacy. His name was Jeff Davis. He led a regiment of Mississippians in the Mexican War, and they were issued the Model 41, and they liked them so much that they nicknamed this gun the Mississippi. We call it the Model 41. It is a rifle. It has a patch box on the rear. That's where you would keep all the patches that we talked about that are greased, and maybe a tool or two. It has a front sight and a rear sight. There's your rear sight. There's your front sight. Now you don't have to just point it like you would point a musket. You can actually sight. You go from an accuracy rating of 50 yards, say with a musket, to 200 yards. But you don't see anything on it that the musket would have had built into it. You see, to a general in the Civil War, they're still trained with tactics, where you shoot the musket until you run out of ammunition. And if you have to do it, you fix a long appendage on the end of the musket in a knife form called a bayonet. And then you charge madly at the enemy, and you try to stab them. That did not happen very often in the Civil War. In fact, many soldiers in the Civil War saw the bayonet as a useless article, except for when it came to sticking a candle in it or digging a trench in a hurry or some other kind of work. So this piece is not equipped for a bayonet.